We've all made promises we thought we'd never have to keep. We've all spoken words in moments of pride that later came back to change our lives completely. Bjorn Stonehelm was a Viking warrior who boasted to anyone who would listen, "If any woman ever beats me in battle, I'll marry her." He laughed when he said it. Everyone laughed with him. After all, who could defeat the strongest fighter in the northern lands? Then Sigrid Ravensblade arrived at the spring tournament. This fierce Shieldmaiden had travelled from the mountain clans with one purpose: to make Bjorn pay for wronging her sister. She entered the fighting circle in disguise, sword in hand, fire in her eyes. When their blades crossed, something unexpected happened. The proud warrior and the vengeful Shieldmaiden discovered that some battles are fought not just with steel, but with hearts. But what happens when winning means losing everything you thought you wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade, and in the great hall of Ironhold, Bjorn Stonehelm polished his silver arm ring with the same methodical care his father had taught him 30 summers ago. The ring had been forged from silver taken in his first real battle, when he was barely old enough to grow a proper beard. Now, at 35, that ring had become more than jewelry. It was proof of a man who had never known defeat. "Still admiring yourself, brother?" Olaf Ironbeard chuckled from across the long table, his weathered hands wrapped around a horn of ale. The two men had fought side by side for over a decade, and Olaf had earned the right to speak plainly to the great Bjorn Stonehelm. Bjorn looked up with that familiar grin that had charmed women and intimidated men across 3 kingdoms. A man should appreciate the fruits of his labor, don't you think? This ring has seen more victories than most warriors see in a lifetime. The great hall buzzed with the comfortable noise of morning preparation. Servants moved between the long tables, setting out bread and cheese for the warriors who would soon depart for the spring tournament at Ravensholm. The tournament was a tradition older than memory, where fighters from every corner of the northern lands gathered to test their mettle and earn glory. For Bjorn, it was simply another opportunity to remind the world why his name was spoken with reverence. "You know," Bjorn continued, twisting the ring around his thick finger, "I've been thinking about that oath I made last summer." Olaf nearly choked on his ale. "The one about marrying any woman who can best you. Please tell me you haven't grown serious about that foolishness." "Foolishness?" Bjorn's blue eyes sparkled with mischief. "My friend, I've been fighting for 20 years. I faced berserkers, champion warriors, and battle-hardened jarls. Not one has managed to put my back to the ground. What woman could possibly—" "Famous last words," interrupted Magnus the Wise from the head of the table. The old skald had seen more battles than any of them, and his grey beard held the weight of countless stories. "I've lived long enough to know that the gods have a sense of humor about such declarations." Bjorn rose from his seat, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he looked every inch the legendary warrior. His blonde hair was braided with silver threads, and scars crossed his arms like a map of his victories. "The gods favor the bold, old man. And besides, what harm could come from a little boast among friends?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bjorn's lieutenant, Eric Ravenscar, who burst through the great doors with mud on his boots and urgency in his voice. "Bjorn, we have visitors approaching the gates. A small party from the mountain clans. The mountain clans rarely descended to the coastal settlements, preferring their isolated peaks and ancient ways. When they did venture down, it usually meant important business or trouble." "How many?" Bjorn asked, his warrior instincts immediately alert. "Maybe a dozen." "They're flying the banner of the Ravensblades." Magnus stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The Ravensblades. I haven't seen their colors in these parts for years. Last I heard, they'd suffered some misfortune. Lost their youngest daughter to raiders, if memory serves." Bjorn's expression grew serious. His warband had been accused of many things over the years, but he ran an honorable company. Still, the mountain clans had long memories and their own sense of justice. We'll meet them at the gates. Full courtesy, but ready for anything. The morning air was crisp as Bjorn led his men across the courtyard. Ironhold had been built by his grandfather on a strategic rise overlooking the fjord, its stone walls weathered but strong. The great gates stood open, as they always did during peacetime. But guards flanked the entrance with casual alertness. The mountain clan riders approached slowly, their horses small but sturdy, bred for climbing rocky paths that would kill lowland steeds. At their head rode a figure that made Bjorn pause, a woman warrior, her face partially hidden by a wolf fur hood, but her bearing unmistakably that of a seasoned fighter. As they drew closer, Bjorn could see more details. She carried herself with the controlled grace of someone comfortable with violence, and the sword at her side was no ceremonial piece. Her horse was better than the others, a grey mare with intelligent eyes, and she rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. "Welcome to Ironhold," Bjorn called out as the riders stopped before the gates. "I am Bjorn Stonehelm, Jarl of this hold. What brings the mountain clans to our shores?" The woman pushed back her hood, revealing sharp features and eyes the color of winter storms. Her dark hair was braided with small bones and silver clasps, and a scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, a mark that spoke of serious combat. When she smiled, it held no warmth. "I am Sigrid, daughter of Hakan Ravensblade," she said, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "We ride to Ravensholm for the tournament. We seek guest right for the night." Guest right was sacred among the northern peoples. No honorable warrior could refuse hospitality to travelers, even enemies, once it was properly requested. But something in the woman's tone suggested this was more than a simple request for shelter. "The hospitality of Ironhold is yours," Bjorn replied formally. "Your horses will be fed, your people housed, and your weapons respected." "Generous words from the famous Bjorn Stonehelm," Sigrid said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you're the finest warrior in the coastal lands." There was something in her tone, not quite mockery, but certainly not simple admiration. Bjorn studied her more carefully. She was beautiful in the way that sharp steel is beautiful, all clean lines and barely contained danger. Her leather armor was well maintained but showed the wear of serious use, and she moved like a predator. "Reputation is earned one battle at a time," he said carefully. "Will you and your people honor us by sharing our table tonight?" "We would be honored," she replied, but her eyes never left his face. "I confess, I'm curious to meet the man who claims he would marry any woman who could defeat him in combat." The words hung in the air like the ring of steel on steel. Around them, conversation stopped as men turned to stare. Bjorn felt the familiar thrill of challenge, but also something else, a strange flutter in his chest that he didn't immediately recognize. "You've heard that story, have you?" He grinned, but it felt less natural than usual. "Tales grow in the telling, do they?" Sigrid tilted her head slightly. "Then you deny making such a boast?" There was something dangerous in the question, a trap he couldn't quite see the shape of. But Bjorn had never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. "I deny nothing. A man should stand by his words." "Good," she said, and her smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "I would hate to think the great Bjorn Stonehelm was merely all talk." That evening the great hall of Ironhold had been transformed. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, and barrels of the finest ale. The mountain clan warriors mingled with Bjorn's men, sharing stories and comparing weapons with the careful courtesy of professional fighters. But through it all, Bjorn found his attention drawn to Sigrid. She sat at his right hand, as was proper for an honored guest. But she ate sparingly and spoke little. When she did contribute to the conversation, her words were measured and precise, revealing nothing of her true intentions. She asked questions about the tournament, about the other warriors who would be competing, about the rules and traditions. "The tournament has changed little over the years," Magnus was explaining. "Single combat in the circle, weapons of the fighter's choice, victory by yield, unconsciousness, or death." Sigrid finished quietly. Rarely, Bjorn interjected. Most warriors know when they're beaten. There's no shame in yielding to save your life. And if someone were foolish enough to make a public boast, she asked, say about marrying their defeater, would that change the stakes? The question was asked casually, but Bjorn felt every eye in the hall turned toward him. He took a long drink of ale, using the moment to study Sigrid's face. There was something there, some purpose that went beyond simple curiosity. A man's word is his bond, he said finally. If I made such a promise, I would honor it, even if the woman in question had personal grievances against you. Now the trap was becoming visible. Bjorn set down his horn and turned to face her fully. Is there something you wish to say directly, Sigrid Ravensblade? She was quiet for a long moment, and the hall grew still around them. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain and fresh determination. My sister was named Astrid. She was 16 when your warband raided the valley of Grimhold 3 summers ago. Bjorn's blood went cold. He remembered Grimhold, a minor action, barely worth calling a raid. They'd been hired by a local jarl to settle a boundary dispute, nothing more. But sometimes, in the heat of battle, things happened that no one intended. She wasn't a warrior, Sigrid continued, her voice steady but her knuckles white where they gripped her ale horn. She was just a girl who happened to be in the wrong place when your men came through. One of them, I never learned which, decided she looked like fine sport. The silence in the hall was absolute now. Every warrior present understood what those words meant and what they demanded. When I found her, Sigrid's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, she was broken. She lived another year, but she never spoke again, never laughed. Just existed until the fever took her last winter. Bjorn closed his eyes, feeling the weight of old sins settling on his shoulders. He had always tried to run an honorable warband, but he knew that in the chaos of battle, not every man followed orders. The thought that one of his warriors had violated a young girl made his stomach turn. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. If one of my men did this thing, then I bear responsibility. What would you have of me? Sigrid looked at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in her mind. I would have justice, but not the kind that comes from a blade in the dark or poison in wine. I want to face you in the circle before witnesses according to the old laws. You want single combat. I want to beat you, she said simply. And when I do, I want you to remember my sister's name. I want you to carry the knowledge that Astrid Ravensblade was avenged by her sisters. And Bjorn looked into her storm-grey eyes and saw something that chilled him more than anger or hatred. He saw absolute certainty. This woman truly believed she could defeat him. More than that, she had planned this moment, traveled hundreds of miles for this confrontation. And if you lose, he asked quietly. Her smile returned, cold and sharp. Then I suppose you'll have yourself a wife, won't you? After all, a man's word is his bond. The challenge had been made, witnessed by dozens of warriors from multiple clans. There could be no backing down now, no diplomatic solution. Tomorrow, at the tournament in Ravensholm, Bjorn Stonehelm would face Sigrid Ravensblade in single combat, with his undefeated record and his foolish boast hanging in the balance. As the evening wore on and the conversations gradually resumed, Bjorn found himself studying his challenger with new eyes. She was dangerous, that much was clear. But there was something else there, something that went beyond simple vengeance. In the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, he recognized a kindred spirit, a warrior born, shaped by loss and hardened by purpose. For the first time in 20 years, Bjorn Stonehelm went to bed with doubt in his heart and uncertainty in his mind. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight brought only questions and the strange, unsettling realization that his silver arm ring might not be the only thing about to change hands. Dawn came grey and cold over Ravensholm. The ancient tournament grounds shrouded in mist that rolled off the sea like the breath of sleeping giants. Bjorn had barely slept, his mind churning with memories of battles past and the weight of Sigrid's accusations. He stood at the edge of the competitors' camp, watching the fog slowly lift to reveal the great stone circle where warriors had tested themselves for generations. The fighting ring was carved from black granite, worn smooth by countless feet and stained dark by the blood of heroes. Around its perimeter, wooden stands rose in tiers, already filling with spectators who had travelled from across the northern lands. This was more than entertainment. It was where reputations were made and legends were born. "She's already here," Olaf said quietly, joining Bjorn at the overlook. "Been practicing since before sunrise." Bjorn followed his friend's gaze to see Sigrid in a smaller training circle, her sword moving in patterns that spoke of years of disciplined study. Even from this distance, he could see the fluid grace of her movements, the perfect balance between offense and defense. This was no amateur seeking revenge. This was a master craftswoman preparing her tools. "What do you know about mountain clan fighting techniques?" Bjorn asked. "Enough to be worried," Olaf replied grimly. "They don't fight like us coastal folk. Less emphasis on brute strength, more on speed and precision. They say their warriors can strike faster than a snake and disappear like shadows." Bjorn touched his silver arm ring unconsciously, feeling its familiar weight. "Every fighting style has weaknesses. Every fighter has weaknesses too," Olaf countered. "The question is whether she's found yours." The morning progressed with the usual tournament rituals. Warriors registered their weapons, healers inspected the combat gear, and the tournament master, a grizzled veteran named Thorvald Greybeard, explained the rules to the gathered fighters. But underneath the familiar pageantry, Bjorn sensed an unusual tension. Word of his challenge had spread, and everyone wanted to see if the great Bjorn Stonehelm would finally meet his match. When the horn sounded for the first matches, Bjorn made his way to the competitors' area near the ring. The wooden token he drew from the leather bag bore the rune for eagle. He would fight in the afternoon session. As he turned from the selection table, he nearly collided with Sigrid. Up close, in the morning light, he could see details that had been hidden the night before. Her armor was mountain clan work, steel scales sewn onto leather with silver wire, functional but beautiful. Her sword was unlike anything he'd seen, shorter than his own blade, but perfectly balanced, with runes etched along the fuller that seemed to shimmer in the light. "Nervous?" she asked, her tone conversational but her eyes watchful. "Should I be?" She tilted her head, studying him like a hunter sizing up prey. "Tell me something, Bjorn Stonehelm. When you made that boast about marrying your defeater, were you thinking of any particular woman?" The question caught him off guard. No. It was just words, just words." She repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "So you never imagined what it might be like to be married to a woman who could best you in battle? Never wondered what kind of person she might be?" There was something in her voice, not mockery, but something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps, or even genuine interest. Bjorn found himself really looking at her for the first time, not as an opponent or a threat, but as a woman. The scar on her face didn't diminish her beauty, it enhanced it, speaking of courage and survival. Her eyes held depths he hadn't noticed before, intelligence and pain, and something else he couldn't name. "I never thought it would happen," he admitted. "What about you? When you decided to seek revenge, did you consider that you might end up married to your enemy?" "Every possibility was considered," she said, but something flickered in her expression. Justice was the goal. Everything else is secondary. They were interrupted by a commotion from the main ring. The first match of the day had begun, and the crowd was on its feet as two young warriors traded thunderous blows. But Bjorn barely noticed. Something had passed between him and Sigrid in that brief exchange. A moment of connection that had nothing to do with their conflict. "I should go," Sigrid said. But she didn't move. "Your sister," Bjorn said suddenly. "What was she like?" The question seemed to surprise her. For a moment the warrior's mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "She was light. Where I was serious, she was joyful. Where I studied the sword, she studied songs. She made everything brighter just by being there. I would have protected her if I'd known," Bjorn said quietly. "Whatever happened, it wasn't by my order." "I know." The admission seemed to cost her something. I've spent 3 years learning everything I could about you, about your warband, about that day. You're not the monster I wanted you to be. Then why are we doing this?" Sigrid's expression hardened again. "Because someone has to pay. Because my sister deserves justice. Because I gave my word to her grave that I would see this through." She turned to go, then paused. "There's something else you should know. I didn't come here just to beat you. I came here to understand you, to see if the man who would make such a boast was worth the price I've paid to get here. And what have you decided? Ask me again after our swords have spoken." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of combat. Bjorn watched the matches with professional interest, noting techniques and weaknesses, but his mind kept drifting to Sigrid's words. She had studied him for 3 years, longer than some marriages lasted. What had she learned in all that time? What had she seen in him that he didn't see in himself? When his turn finally came, the crowd roared its approval. Bjorn Stonehelm was a favorite wherever warriors gathered, known for his strength and skill, but also for his fair dealing and good humor. He raised his sword in salute to the stands, and the cheers grew louder. His opponent was a young champion from the eastern settlements, eager to make his name by defeating a legend. The fight was over quickly. The boy was skilled but inexperienced, and Bjorn put him down with a combination his grandfather had taught him. As always, he helped his defeated opponent to his feet and offered words of encouragement, but as he left the ring, his eyes found Sigrid in the crowd. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, taking note of every move he'd made. When their eyes met, she nodded once, acknowledgement of his skill perhaps, or simply recognition that their time was approaching. The afternoon brought more matches, each one building anticipation for the main event. Sigrid's bout came just before his, and Bjorn watched from the competitors' area as she faced a veteran warrior from the western fjords. The man was skilled and experienced, with reach and weight advantages that should have made the contest one-sided. Instead, Bjorn witnessed something extraordinary. Sigrid didn't fight like any warrior he'd ever seen. She moved like water, flowing around her opponent's attacks and striking from unexpected angles. Her shorter sword became an advantage in close quarters, and her mountain-trained reflexes allowed her to avoid blows that should have connected. When she finally brought her opponent down, it was with a combination so fast and fluid that half the crowd missed it entirely as she helped her defeated foe to his feet, showing the same courtesy Bjorn had displayed. Their eyes met across the ring. This time, her expression was clear. She was ready. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Thorvald Greybeard called for the final match of the day. The crowd had swollen to capacity, with late arrivals standing 3 deep behind the wooden stands. Word had spread beyond the tournament grounds. This was the fight everyone had come to see. In the ancient tradition of single combat, Thorvald's voice carried across the grounds. "We have a challenge match. Bjorn Stonehelm of Ironhold, champion of the coastal lands, faces Sigrid Ravensblade of the mountain clans. The stakes," he paused dramatically, "are as the warriors themselves have set them." A murmur ran through the crowd as people whispered about Bjorn's famous boast. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but all leaned forward in anticipation. Bjorn stepped into the ring, his sword in his right hand, his shield in his left. The black granite felt solid under his feet, and the familiar pre-battle calm settled over him. This was what he was born for, the moment when everything else fell away and only skill and will remained. Sigrid entered from the opposite side, and the crowd fell silent. In the setting sun, she looked like something from the old stories, a Valkyrie come to test a mortal warrior. Her armor gleamed, her blade caught the light, and her eyes held the steady certainty of someone who had already won this fight in her mind. They met in the center of the ring, as tradition demanded, and Thorvald stepped between them. "This is single combat by challenge," he announced. "Victory by yield, unconsciousness, or inability to continue. Are the warriors ready?" "Ready," Bjorn said, his voice steady. "Ready," Sigrid replied, and her sword whispered as she drew it fully from its sheath. Thorvald stepped back. Begin! For a heartbeat, neither warrior moved. They circled each other slowly, weapons ready, eyes locked. This wasn't just about victory or defeat anymore. It was about justice and honor, about promises made and prices to be paid. In that moment before the storm, Bjorn realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. Then Sigrid attacked, and the real fight began. The clash of steel rang across Ravensholm like a bell calling souls to judgment. Sigrid's first strike came faster than Bjorn had anticipated, her blade seeking the gap between his shield and shoulder guard with surgical precision. He barely managed to deflect it, the force of her attack sending vibrations up his arm. She was already moving before his counterstrike could land, flowing around his shield bash like smoke around stone. Her mountain clan training showed in every movement. She fought like the terrain she came from, all sudden drops and unexpected angles. Where Bjorn's style was built on strength and endurance, hers was crafted from speed and misdirection. First blood to the mountain warrior. Thorvald called out as Sigrid's blade found a gap in Bjorn's mail, leaving a thin red line across his ribs. The crowd roared, half in shock, half in excitement. Many had never seen Bjorn bleed in single combat. Bjorn touched his side and looked at the crimson on his fingers with something approaching wonder. When was the last time an opponent had marked him so early in a fight? When was the last time anyone had marked him at all? Impressive, he said, raising his voice to be heard over the crowd. Your reputation doesn't do you justice. Sigrid didn't respond with words. Instead, she pressed her attack, her sword weaving patterns in the air that seemed to come from all directions at once. Bjorn found himself giving ground, his shield work becoming more defensive as he tried to read her rhythm. But there was no rhythm. She was chaos given form, unpredictable as a mountain storm. The obsidian pendant at her throat caught the light as she moved, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Ravensblade warriors. Bjorn noticed it during a brief respite, recognizing the craftsmanship even in the heat of battle. The black stone was carved with protective runes, and something about it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. You're holding back, Sigrid said during their next exchange, her breathing still controlled despite the intensity of their combat. Why? It was a fair question. Bjorn was fighting defensively, more concerned with understanding her style than overwhelming her with his superior strength. Part of it was tactical. Every warrior knew the value of letting an opponent reveal their capabilities before committing to a decisive assault. But part of it was something else, something he didn't want to examine too closely. Maybe I'm just getting old, he replied, punctuating the words with a shield bash that forced her to dance backward. Or maybe you don't want to hurt me. Her smile was sharp. But there was something else there, curiosity, perhaps even hope. Tell me, great warrior, what happens when your famous strength meets someone who doesn't fear it? She proved her point by ducking under his neck swing and coming up inside his guard, her pommel striking his solar plexus with precise force. Bjorn staggered back, gasping, and the crowd noise reached a new crescendo. This wasn't going the way anyone had expected. You've been studying me, Bjorn managed, circling to keep her at sword's length while he caught his breath. For 3 years, she confirmed. I know every victory you've ever won, every technique you favor, every weakness you've tried to hide. She feinted left, then struck right, her blade ringing against his shield boss. I know you favor your right leg after that injury at Grimvold. I know you drop your shoulder before your killing stroke. I know you've never faced anyone who could match your reach and exceed your speed. The words stung because they were true. Bjorn had built his reputation on being faster and stronger than his opponents. But what happened when those advantages were neutralized? When was the last time he'd been truly tested? As if reading his thoughts, Sigrid pressed her advantage. Her next attack was a blur of motion, her sword seeming to multiply as it sought gaps in his defense. Bjorn managed to block or deflect most of the strikes, but not all. Another line of red appeared across his sword arm, then another across his thigh. The crowd was on its feet now, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The undefeated Bjorn Stonehelm was not just being challenged, he was losing. "Yield," Sigrid said during their next pause, her breathing slightly heavier now, but her voice steady. "You fought well, but this can only end one way." Bjorn wiped blood from a cut above his eye and considered her words. Any rational warrior would recognize the tactical situation. She was faster, better prepared, and had already proven she could penetrate his defenses at will. His pride said fight on, but his experience warned that continuing would only lead to greater injury. But something else held him back from surrender, something that had nothing to do with pride or tactical considerations. He was enjoying this. For the first time in years, he was facing an opponent who challenged not just his body, but his mind. Every exchange taught him something new about combat, about himself, about the woman across from him who had dedicated years of her life to this single moment. "Not yet," he said, raising his sword again. "I'm learning things I never knew about fighting, and I'm learning things I never knew about you," she replied. But there was something different in her tone now, less cold fury, more complex emotion. Their next exchange was different from what had come before. Instead of overwhelming aggression from Sigrid and defensive responses from Bjorn, they began to truly duel. Bjorn adapted his style to match hers, trading some of his power for increased speed and precision. Sigrid, perhaps recognizing the shift, began to press harder, knowing that a prolonged fight might favor the larger warrior's endurance. The obsidian pendant at her throat swung as she moved, and Bjorn found his eyes drawn to it repeatedly. There was something hypnotic about the way it caught the light, something that spoke of deep magic and ancient power. Mountain clan shamans were known for their skill with protective charms and battle blessings. "The pendant," he said during a brief pause. "A gift from your clan's wise woman?" Sigrid's hand went automatically to her throat, and for just a moment her guard dropped. "From my sister. She made it for me before." Her voice trailed off, pain flickering across her features. That moment of distraction was all Bjorn needed. His training took over, and his sword swept in an arc that should have ended the fight. But even heartbroken and off balance, Sigrid's reflexes saved her. She managed to get her blade up in time to deflect his strike, though the force of it drove her to one knee. The crowd held its breath as Bjorn stood over her, his sword poised for a finishing blow. This was the moment. Victory was within his reach. All he had to do was complete the strike, and his reputation would remain intact. Instead, he stepped back and extended his hand to help her up. "Your sister had skilled hands," he said quietly. "The pendant is beautiful work." Sigrid stared at his offered hand for a long moment, something shifting in her storm-grey eyes. When she took it and allowed him to help her to her feet, the simple gesture seemed to change the very air around them. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the confused murmur of the crowd. "Because," Bjorn said, surprised by his own certainty, "I want to see what you do next." The words hung between them, like a challenge of a different sort entirely, and both warriors knew that they had moved beyond simple combat into something far more dangerous and far more meaningful. The gesture changed everything. Where moments before there had been calculated violence, now there was something else, a recognition that passed between them like a shared secret. Sigrid accepted his hand and rose to her feet, but she didn't immediately resume her fighting stance. "The crowd grows restless," she observed, glancing at the stands where spectators were calling out questions and encouragement in equal measure. They had come to see a decisive victory, not this strange dance of honor and hesitation. "Let them wait," Bjorn replied, rolling his shoulders to work out the tension. "This fight isn't for their entertainment, isn't it?" Sigrid tilted her head, studying his face. "You're Bjorn Stonehelm, champion of the coastal lands, beloved by crowds wherever you go. I thought you lived for their approval." "Perhaps I did once." He touched the cuts she had given him, feeling the sting of honest wounds. "Tell me something. When you dreamed of this moment, how did you imagine it would end?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers unconsciously touching the obsidian pendant at her throat. "With justice served," with my sister's memory honored, with you understanding the cost of your warband's actions. And now I'm not certain what justice looks like anymore." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "You're not the man I expected to face." Thorvald Greybeard stepped closer to the center of the ring, his weathered face showing concern. "Warriors, the sun grows low. Will you continue, or do you wish to declare an outcome?" Neither fighter answered immediately. The tournament master's question forced them to confront the reality of their situation. They were locked in single combat, with clear stakes before hundreds of witnesses. Personal revelations aside, one of them would have to yield or be defeated. "What happens?" Sigrid asked quietly. "If I win but find I no longer want the prize?" "What happens?" Bjorn countered. "If I lose but discover I don't mind the consequences?" Their eyes met across the space between them, and something passed there that had nothing to do with sword work or revenge. For just a moment, they saw each other not as enemies or symbols, but as people, complex, flawed, carrying their own burdens and hopes. The moment was broken by a voice from the crowd. "Fight or forfeit!" Someone shouted and others took up the call. The spectators had paid good silver to see combat, and they were growing impatient with philosophy. "They have a point," Bjorn said, raising his sword again. "We can't stand here forever." "No," Sigrid agreed, settling back into her fighting stance. "But we can finish this properly." The ancient war horn of Clan Ravensblade hung from her belt, carved from the tusk of a great walrus and inscribed with runes of victory. Her grandfather had carried it into battle against the southern kings, and her father had sounded it during the mountain wars. Now it seemed to call to her, reminding her of duty and purpose. What followed was unlike any combat the tournament grounds had ever witnessed. Both warriors fought with a new intensity, but it was tempered by something that hadn't been there before: respect. Bjorn no longer held back his strength, but he used it with surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. Sigrid pressed her advantages without mercy, but she did so with a grace that bordered on artistry. Their blades met in a series of exchanges that drew gasps from the crowd. Bjorn's experience showed in his ability to read her attacks and counter them, but Sigrid's preparation and natural speed kept her always one step ahead of his responses. Blood flowed from both warriors now, nothing serious, but enough to stain their armor and remind them that this was still a fight with consequences. "You're getting faster," Sigrid observed during a brief pause. Breathing hard now as the extended combat took its toll. "You're making me faster," he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "I haven't been pushed like this in years." "Good. A warrior without challenges grows soft." She adjusted her grip on her sword, and he noticed her knuckles were scraped from deflecting his shield work. "But speed alone won't save you." She proved her point with a combination that seemed to come from 3 directions at once. Her blade found the gap between his helmet and gorget, drawing a line of fire across his neck. If she had wanted to kill him, she could have. The realization struck them both simultaneously. "Why didn't you finish it?" he asked, touching the shallow cut that could so easily have been deeper. "Because I want to beat you, not murder you," she said simply. There's a difference. The distinction mattered more than he expected. This wasn't an execution or an assassination, it was a test, a measuring of one warrior against another. The knowledge changed how he fought, allowing him to commit fully, without the fear that a mistake would mean death. Their next exchange brought them close enough to see the flecks of gold in each other's eyes, close enough that their breathing mingled in the cooling air. Bjorn's shield rim caught the edge of her helmet, and Sigrid's pommel strike found the gap in his elbow guard. They separated, both marked, both learning. "Your sister," Bjorn said as they circled each other again. What would she think of this? The question made Sigrid stumble slightly, and he realized he had touched something deep. She would tell me to stop thinking so much and trust my instincts. Wise advice. What do your instincts tell you now? She paused in her circling, and for a moment her warrior's mask slipped completely. That this isn't about revenge anymore. That somehow in the space of one fight, everything I thought I wanted has changed. Then what is it about? Finding out who we really are when everything else is stripped away. She raised her sword again, but there was something different in her stance now. Less aggressive, more exploratory. Finding out if the stories we tell ourselves are true. The horn at her belt seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, echoing the beat of her heart. It had been carved to inspire courage in battle, but now it reminded her that some battles were fought not against enemies, but against the limitations we place on ourselves. One more exchange, she said, and her voice carried a finality that made the crowd lean forward in anticipation. Whatever happens, happens. Bjorn nodded, understanding that they had reached the moment of truth. All the conversation, all the careful testing, all the mutual respect had led to this, one final test of skill, will, and perhaps something deeper. They came together with everything they had, and the sound of their meeting echoed across the tournament grounds like thunder. The final exchange lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, but it contained a lifetime of movement. Sigrid's attack came as a flowing series of strikes, each one building on the last, her sword seeming to multiply as it sought every gap in Bjorn's defense. He met her blade for blade, his own weapon moving in patterns his grandfather had taught him, refined by decades of experience and perfected by desperate need. When the flurry ended, both warriors stood frozen in a tableau that would be remembered for generations. Sigrid's blade rested against Bjorn's throat just above the mailcoif, while his sword point pressed against her heart, held back only by the steel scales of her armor. Neither moved, neither breathed, both balanced on the knife's edge between victory and defeat. The crowd was absolutely silent. "Well," Bjorn said quietly, his voice barely audible, "this is awkward, despite everything, the tension, the stakes, the hundreds of watching eyes." Sigrid laughed. It was a sound like silver bells in a winter wind, and it transformed her entire face. "Perhaps we should call it a draw." "I don't think Thorvald's rules account for draws," Bjorn replied, but he was smiling too. "Someone has to yield. Ladies first. Age before beauty." They stood there for another moment, weapons poised, neither willing to complete the killing stroke that would end the contest. Finally, as if by mutual agreement, both warriors stepped back and lowered their swords. "I yield," Sigrid said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent tournament grounds. The words hit Bjorn like a physical blow. "What? No, you had me. Your blade was at my throat, and yours was at my heart," she replied calmly. "The outcome was death for both or yield by one. I choose to yield." But Bjorn started to protest, then stopped. The look in her eyes told him that this decision had nothing to do with the position of their swords, and everything to do with choices that went far deeper than combat. Thorvald Greybeard stepped forward, clearly as confused as everyone else. "The mountain warrior yields to Bjorn Stonehelm. Victory to—" "No!" Bjorn's voice cut across the tournament master's announcement. "I yield as well." The crowd erupted in confusion. Thorvald threw his hands up in exasperation. "You cannot both yield. Someone must be declared victor." "Then declare us both defeated," Sigrid suggested. "Or both victorious. Or flip a coin. The important thing is that the combat is over." But as she spoke, something caught Bjorn's eye. The obsidian pendant at her throat was glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. As he watched, transfixed, hairline cracks appeared across its surface, spreading like a spider's web through the black stone. "Your pendant," he said urgently. "Something's happening to it." Sigrid looked down and saw the cracks spreading. Without warning, the stone shattered completely, fragments of obsidian scattering across the granite floor of the fighting ring. Where the pendant had been, only the silver setting remained, empty and gleaming. "Astrid," she whispered, her hand going to her throat. Then louder as understanding dawned, "It's finished. She's at peace." The broken pendant seemed to shimmer for a moment in the setting sunlight, and then the fragments simply weren't there anymore, as if they had never existed at all. Only the silver setting remained, and somehow that felt exactly right. "The magic is broken," an old voice said from the crowd. Magnus the Wise had made his way to the edge of the ring, his weathered face grave. That was a binding stone. It held purpose and pain in equal measure. Its breaking means the purpose is fulfilled. But I didn't win, Sigrid protested. Justice wasn't served, wasn't it? Magnus asked gently. What is justice, child? Is it blood for blood, pain for pain? Or is it understanding? Is it the recognition that sometimes the greatest victory is choosing not to complete the killing stroke? Sigrid stared at the empty silver setting in her palm. Her sister had made the pendant as protection, but perhaps its true purpose had been something else entirely. Perhaps it had been meant to break when its wearer learned that some battles weren't worth winning. I don't understand, she said. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. Part of her did understand, the part that had laughed in the middle of mortal combat, the part that had yielded when victory was within her grasp, the part that had looked into Bjorn's eyes and seen not an enemy, but a man worth knowing. Understanding will come, Magnus said. But for now, we have a practical problem. This combat was witnessed by hundreds of people, many of whom traveled great distances to see its outcome. They deserve an answer to the question that brought them here. He was right, of course. The crowd was growing restless, conversations breaking out in multiple languages as people tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Some were calling for the combat to resume, others were debating the meaning of the pendant's destruction, and a few enterprising individuals were already taking bets on what would happen next. The answer is simple enough, Bjorn said, his voice carrying across the tournament grounds with the authority of a born leader. I made a boast that I would marry any woman who could defeat me in single combat. The question before us is whether defeat occurred today. He turned to face Sigrid fully, and his next words were spoken directly to her, though his voice remained loud enough for all to hear. You drew first blood. You controlled the pace of the fight from beginning to end. You had your sword at my throat in the final exchange. By any reasonable measure, you defeated me. But I yielded, Sigrid said, her own voice carrying clearly. A warrior who yields has lost, regardless of position or advantage. Then we're back where we started, Thorvald muttered. Two warriors, each claiming to have lost to the other. Not quite, Bjorn said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone listen more carefully. There's a third possibility that none of us have considered. He reached up and removed his silver arm ring, the symbol of his undefeated status, the mark of his identity as a champion. The metal gleamed in the failing light, 20 years of victories made manifest in silver and craft. Sigrid Ravensblade, he said formally, you came here seeking justice for your sister's death. You have shown me that strength without wisdom is hollow, that victory without honor is meaningless, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies in choosing not to fight. He held out the ring to her, and his voice dropped to something more personal. You also showed me something I didn't know I was looking for, a worthy opponent who became something more. So I ask you, not as a defeated warrior honoring a boast, but as a man who has found something precious in the most unexpected place, will you marry me? The tournament grounds fell absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited for Sigrid's answer. In her hand, the empty silver setting caught the last rays of sunlight, and somehow it seemed to shine brighter than the obsidian had ever done. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fraught with the weight of choices that would echo through the rest of their lives. Sigrid stood in the center of the ring, the weight of hundreds of watching eyes pressing down on her like a physical thing. In her left hand, she held the empty silver setting that had once contained her sister's obsidian pendant. In her right, Bjorn's offered arm ring caught the dying light, 20 years of victories reduced to a simple circle of metal. You want me to answer now? She asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Here before all these people, without time to think or consider or... Yes, Bjorn said simply. Some decisions are too important for thinking. They require something else entirely. And what would that be? Trust, he replied, and the word carried weight in the evening air. Trust in what happened between us in this ring. Trust in what we saw in each other when everything else was stripped away. Sigrid looked at the faces surrounding them, warriors, Merchants, farmers, nobles, all waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve. Some showed curiosity, others amusement, and more than a few displayed the kind of bloodthirsty disappointment that came when a promising fight ended without a clear victor. "They're not going to let us leave without an answer," she observed. "Probably not," Bjorn agreed. "Though if you wanted to fight our way out, I'd be willing to stand back to back with you against the lot of them." Despite everything, she smiled at that. A romantic proposal and an offer of mutual combat in the same breath. "You certainly know how to charm a woman." "I'm learning as I go," he admitted. "This isn't exactly a situation they prepare you for in warrior training." Thorvald Greybeard cleared his throat diplomatically. "While this is all very touching, the sun is setting and people have wages to settle. Could we perhaps reach some form of conclusion before full dark?" Sigrid looked at the ancient tournament master, then at the crowd, then finally back at Bjorn. In the failing light, his face showed the honest weariness of a man who had fought well and bled freely. The cuts she had given him were still seeping slightly, and she found herself wanting to tend to those wounds, to make sure they healed cleanly. When had that started? When had her concern shifted from giving him wounds to healing them? "The pendant breaking," she said thoughtfully. "Magnus said it meant the purpose was fulfilled, but I'm not sure I understand what that purpose was anymore." "Perhaps," said a new voice from the crowd, "the purpose was never revenge at all." The speaker was an elderly woman, bent with age, but walking with the confident step of someone accustomed to being heard. She wore the blue robes of a seer, and the silver torque around her neck marked her as a wise woman of considerable standing. "Grandmother Helga," Sigrid breathed, recognizing the voice, if not immediately seeing the face in the gathering darkness. "What are you doing here?" "Following a stubborn granddaughter who left the mountain without permission," the old woman replied tartly. "Though I must say, you've provided quite the entertainment." She made her way through the crowd, which parted respectfully before her. When she reached the edge of the ring, she studied both warriors with eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. "The pendant," she continued, "was made by your sister." "Yes, but not as you remember it. Astrid brought it to me the night before she died, along with a request that made very little sense at the time." Sigrid's breath caught. "What kind of request?" "She asked me to bind it with a seeing spell, to let it guide you to what you needed most. Not what you wanted, what you needed. She said you would understand when the time came." Helga's ancient eyes glittered in the torchlight. "I think that time has arrived." The revelation hit Sigrid like a physical blow. Her sister, dying and broken, had still been thinking of her welfare, had still been trying to protect her, to guide her towards something better than the path of vengeance she was already planning. "She knew," Sigrid whispered. "Somehow, she knew I would come here seeking revenge." "Astrid was always the wiser of you two," Helga said gently. "She understood that revenge would destroy you as surely as it destroyed her attacker. The pendant was meant to shatter when you found something worth more than vengeance." Bjorn had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. "The magic wasn't meant to help her defeat me. It was meant to help her find a reason not to." "Precisely," Helga confirmed. "Though I must say, young warrior, you made the task more difficult than necessary. That boast of yours about marrying your defeater, did you really think the gods wouldn't take you up on it eventually?" "The thought had occurred to me," Bjorn said ruefully. "Usually about 3 ales into any evening." The old seer cackled with amusement. "Well, you can't say you weren't warned. Now, granddaughter, what's your answer? Will you honor your sister's wisdom, or will you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been?" Sigrid looked down at the 2 pieces of metal in her hands, the empty silver setting that represented freedom from the past, and the heavy arm ring that represented an uncertain but promising future. The choice should have been difficult, should have required careful consideration and lengthy debate. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I have conditions," she said, looking directly at Bjorn. "Name them." "First, this isn't because of some boast, or because I defeated you, or because of anything that happened in this ring. If I say yes, it's because I choose to freely and without compulsion. Agreed. Second, I don't become some ornamental wife who sits in your hall and tends your hearth. I'm a warrior, and I intend to remain one. I would be disappointed with anything else, Bjorn said sincerely. A man who would change the very thing he admires most about a woman is a fool. Third, and here her voice grew more serious, there will be changes in how your warband operates. No more raids on settlements, no more actions that put innocents at risk. If we do this, we do it honorably. Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing the implications. His warband was his livelihood, his reputation, his identity. She was asking him to fundamentally alter how he lived his life. That's a significant change, he said finally. Yes, it is. Is it one you can accept? He looked at her for a long moment, then at the crowd, then back to her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. For you, I can accept it. For us, I will embrace it. The crowd had been growing restless during their extended negotiation, but now they leaned forward again, sensing that the moment of decision had arrived. Sigrid took a deep breath and looked once more at the empty silver setting in her palm. Then, with deliberate care, she slipped Bjorn's arm ring onto her finger. It was too large for her, but somehow it felt exactly right. Yes, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the tournament grounds. I will marry you, Bjorn Stonehelm, not because of any boast or any defeat, but because you showed me that some battles are worth losing and some victories are worth sharing. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Sigrid barely heard them. All her attention was focused on Bjorn's face as he smiled, really smiled. Not the practiced grin of a public figure, but something genuine and warm, and entirely for her. He reached out and took her hands, the silver ring gleaming between them like a promise made manifest. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the tournament grounds had ever witnessed. What had begun as a simple combat had transformed into an impromptu wedding announcement, and the crowd's mood shifted from confusion to festive anticipation. Wine appeared from somewhere, along with bread and cheese, and soon half the tournament grounds had transformed into a spontaneous feast. But as Bjorn and Sigrid made their way through the well-wishers and curious spectators, a commotion near the main gates caught their attention. A rider was approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Even from a distance, they could see the urgency in his posture. That's one of my scouts, Bjorn said, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Something's wrong. The rider, a young man named Leif Swiftarrow, practically fell from his saddle as he reached the tournament grounds. His face was pale with exhaustion and something else. Fear. Bjorn, he called out, pushing through the crowd. Thank the gods you're here. We have to return to Ironhold immediately. The hold is under siege. The festive atmosphere died instantly. Warriors reached for weapons that many had set aside for the evening's celebration, and conversations dropped to urgent whispers. Siege. Bjorn's voice carried the sharp edge of command. By whom? How many? The Bloodaxe clan, Leif gasped, still catching his breath. Hakan Bloodaxe himself leads them, with maybe 200 warriors. They arrived yesterday morning and have surrounded the hold. They're demanding— He paused, glancing nervously at Sigrid. They're demanding you surrender yourself for judgment. Judgment for what? Sigrid asked, though something cold was beginning to form in her stomach. Leif looked even more uncomfortable. For the death of Hakan's son, Eric Bloodaxe. They claim Bjorn's warband killed him during a raid last spring. The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Bjorn's face went ashen, and he sat down heavily on a nearby bench. Eric Bloodaxe. Gods curse it all. You remember him? Sigrid's voice was carefully controlled, but Bjorn could hear the tension underneath. I remember the raid, Bjorn said slowly. It was supposed to be simple. Protect a merchant caravan from bandits. But the bandits turned out to be Bloodaxe warriors, and their leader was a young man who fought like 10 devils. He wouldn't yield, wouldn't retreat, just kept coming until— He trailed off, the memory clearly painful. Until you killed him, Sigrid finished. Until I had no choice but to kill him. It was him or me, and I chose me. Bjorn looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain she hadn't seen before. Just like with your sister, it wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, and now another family seeks justice for their dead. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. Here they stood, having just agreed to marry after resolving Sigrid's quest for vengeance, only to discover that Bjorn faced the same situation with another grieving parent. The irony was bitter enough to taste. How long can Ironhold hold out? Olaf asked, having pushed through the crowd to reach them. Not long, Leif replied grimly. Maybe a week if they're careful with supplies. But Hakan didn't come just to starve us out. He brought siege engines, catapults, rams, the works. He means to take the hold by force. Grandmother Helga, who'd been listening from the edge of the circle, stepped forward with her walking stick clicking against the stone. This is no coincidence, she said, her ancient voice carrying clearly. The timing is too perfect, too convenient. What do you mean? Bjorn asked. I mean someone arranged for this news to arrive now, at this moment, when you and my granddaughter had just found peace between yourselves. Her eyes glittered with suspicion. Someone wants to test whether your newfound understanding will survive the weight of old debts. Before anyone could respond to this observation, another voice cut through the gathering, cold, commanding, and entirely unwelcome. Well, well. Bjorn Stonehelm, in the flesh. The crowd parted to reveal a man stepping into the torchlight, flanked by a dozen warriors bearing the red axes of the Bloodaxe clan. The leader was tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue, almost colourless and utterly without warmth. Hakan Bloodaxe, Bjorn said, rising slowly to his feet. I heard you were besieging my hold. I was, Hakan replied with a thin smile. But when I learned you were here, playing at tournaments instead of defending your people, I thought I'd save us all some time and come collect you in person. Your quarrel is with me, not with my people. Is it? Hakan's smile grew colder. Tell me, Stonehelm, do you remember my son Eric? Young man, barely 20, full of fire and dreams of glory. I remember him, Bjorn said quietly. He was a brave warrior who died with his sword in his hand. He was my only child. The words came out flat, emotionless, but somehow that made them more terrible than any shout of rage could have been. My heir, my future, my reason for living. And you cut him down like he was nothing. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and the weight of irreversible loss. Around them, the crowd had grown absolutely silent, sensing they were witnessing something far more dangerous than any tournament combat. If you want satisfaction, Bjorn said carefully, I'm willing to face you in single combat. Winner takes all. Your son's death is either avenged or declared justified. Oh, I don't want satisfaction, Hakan said, and his smile became something predatory. I want you to suffer as I have suffered. I want you to lose everything that matters to you, piece by piece, until you understand what you took from me. He gestured, and one of his warriors stepped forward carrying something wrapped in black cloth. When the cloth was pulled away, it revealed a severed head, weathered, grey-bearded, and unmistakably familiar. Magnus the Wise sends his regards, Hakan said conversationally. Or rather, he would if he still had a tongue to speak with. The sight hit Bjorn like a physical blow. Magnus had been more than a counselor. He had been a father figure, a source of wisdom and stability for over 20 years. To see him reduced to this grotesque trophy was almost too much to bear. You bastard, Olaf snarled, reaching for his sword. But Bjorn caught his arm. No, Bjorn said, though his voice shook with barely controlled rage. This is what he wants, for us to lose our heads and make mistakes. Very good, Hakan approved. You're learning. But the lesson isn't over yet. He gestured again, and another warrior produced a second wrapped bundle. This one was smaller, and when revealed, showed the head of a young woman, barely out of her teens, with blonde braids and features that were achingly familiar. Your cousin Ingrid was quite brave at the end, Hakan continued in that same conversational tone. She actually tried to organize the defense when my men scaled the walls. Admirable really, though ultimately pointless. This time it was Sigrid who had to restrain Bjorn, her hands gripping his arms as he started forward with murder in his eyes. The young woman had been like a daughter to him, the closest thing to family he had left after his parents' deaths. "Now you begin to understand," Hakan said with satisfaction. "This is what it feels like to lose someone precious. But we're not done yet." A third bundle appeared, and when unwrapped, revealed something that made several people in the crowd gasp and turn away. It was the head of a child, a boy perhaps 10 years old, with sandy hair and freckles across his nose. "Little Bjorn," Hakan said, using the pet name that had been given to the boy who served as the hold's messenger and general favorite. "He tried to run when my men came over the walls. Didn't make it very far. The rage that filled Bjorn was unlike anything he had ever experienced. This went beyond combat, beyond honorable conflict, into something monstrous and unforgivable. The child had been innocent of any wrongdoing, guilty of nothing more than loyalty to his lord. "You're not a warrior," Bjorn said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're a butcher." "I'm a father seeking justice for his murdered son," Hakan replied. "And I'm very good at what I do. The question now is, what are you willing to sacrifice to stop me from finishing what I started? Because, make no mistake, there are still people alive in Ironhold, and whether they remain that way depends entirely on your choices over the next few hours." From his belt, he produced a piece of carved whalebone, an ancient horn used for long-distance communication between clans. The runes carved into its surface glowed briefly as he raised it to his lips, and the sound that emerged was deep and resonant, carrying far into the night. "My signal to begin the final assault," he explained, as the horn's call faded. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to come with me now and spare them the unpleasantness." The choice was impossible. Surrender himself to certain death, or allow innocent people to be slaughtered because of his past actions. Either way, the life he had just begun to imagine with Sigrid was over before it had truly begun. But as he struggled with the decision, Sigrid stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "There's a third option you haven't considered," she said to Hakan, her voice carrying the same deadly calm that had marked her combat with Bjorn. "And what would that be, mountain girl?" "You could face both of us," she said simply. "Right here, right now. If you win, Bjorn surrenders himself freely. If we win, you call off your attack and this ends." Hakan studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating. "You would fight beside the man who killed your sister." The words were designed to wound, to drive a wedge between them at the crucial moment. But Sigrid's response was immediate and unwavering. "I would fight beside the man I love," she said, "against any enemy, in any cause, until the end of the world if necessary." The carved horn in Hakan's hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and his smile returned, cold, cruel, and entirely without mercy. Hakan's laughter echoed across the tournament grounds like the caw of a carrion bird. "How touching. The mountain savage thinks love conquers all. Very well, I accept your proposal. But not here, not in this circus atmosphere with merchants and farmers gawking like it's entertainment." He gestured toward the darkness beyond the torchlight, where the ancient stone circle of the old god stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The circle was older than memory, predating even the tournament grounds, its weathered stones marking a place where blood had been spilled in sacred combat for 1,000 years. "There," Hakan said, "where the old laws hold sway and the gods themselves bear witness. 2 against 1, as the lady suggests, but under the ancient rites. Death or yield, no mercy, no quarter, no walking away to fight another day." Bjorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The old circle was sacred ground, where combat took on significance beyond mere victory or defeat. Warriors who fought there were bound by oaths older than kingdoms, and the consequences of those oaths extended far beyond the physical world. "You're talking about blood debt combat," he said slowly. "That's not a game, Hakan. Win or lose, the survivors carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives." "Good," Hakan replied with savage satisfaction. "I want you to carry weight. I want every breath you take to remind you of what you cost me. And if you die, well, that works too. Sigrid placed her hand on Bjorn's arm, feeling the tension coiled there like a drawn bowstring. What exactly are the old laws he's talking about? Combat in the old circle binds not just the fighters, but their bloodlines, Grandmother Helga explained, her voice heavy with foreboding. Victory there doesn't just settle the immediate dispute. It creates obligations that can last for generations. If Hakan wins, he can claim blood debt not just from Bjorn, but from everyone who ever served under his banner. And if we win, then his clan becomes bound to serve yours, Olaf said grimly. The Bloodaxe warriors, their lands, their resources, all of it would belong to Bjorn by right of sacred victory. The implications were staggering. What Hakan was proposing wasn't just personal combat. It was a form of warfare that could reshape the balance of power across the northern lands. No wonder he was so confident. He had probably spent months preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence and planning every detail. There's something else, Magnus had said once, during one of his long winter stories about the old ways. Bjorn could almost hear the old skald's voice now, warning about the dangers of sacred combat. The old circle doesn't just witness oaths, it judges them. Warriors who fight there with false hearts or impure motives. Well, the stones have long memories and longer grudges. You're afraid, Hakan observed, misreading Bjorn's hesitation. I understand. When you killed my son, it was in the heat of battle, probably without thinking. This is different. This is walking deliberately into death, knowing full well what waits for you. I'm not afraid of you, Bjorn said quietly. I'm afraid of what this will cost everyone else if we're wrong. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you started killing other people's children. The words struck home, as they were meant to. Bjorn closed his eyes and saw again the faces of Magnus, of his cousin Ingrid, of little Bjorn, whose only crime had been loyalty. All dead because of choices he had made, actions he had taken, enemies he had created through 20 years of living by the sword. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Sigrid looking at him with an expression of absolute trust. She wasn't looking at a legendary warrior or a famous champion. She was looking at the man she had chosen to stand beside. Whatever the consequences, we do this together, she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Whatever happens, we face it as one. Bjorn felt something settle in his chest, not peace exactly, but a kind of resigned determination. This was his chance to balance the scales, to pay the price for past mistakes with something more valuable than gold or territory. If he and Sigrid died tonight, at least they would die trying to protect the innocent people trapped in Ironhold. Very well, he said to Hakan. The old circle it is. But first I want proof that my people are still alive. I want to see them with my own eyes. Hakan smiled and produced a smaller horn from his belt, this one carved from deer antler and inscribed with different runes. When he blew a short series of notes, the answer came floating back across the night air from the direction of the sea. It was a human voice, calling out words in the ancient tongue of the coastal clans. That's Gunnar One Eye, Olaf said, relief evident in his voice. He's alive, at least. For now, Hakan agreed. But my patience has limits. Dawn is still hours away, but I won't wait beyond the first light of morning. Either you surrender yourself, or I complete the work I started at Ironhold. The carved whalebone horn in his hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Bjorn realized it was more than just a signaling device. The runes carved into its surface were moving, shifting like living things, and the bone itself had taken on a sickly luminescence that hurt to look at directly. That horn, Grandmother Helga said suddenly, her voice sharp with alarm. Where did you get it? A gift from someone who shares my interest in seeing Bjorn Stonehelm brought low, Hakan replied. It has certain properties that make it particularly effective at coordinating large-scale violence. It's cursed, the old wise woman said flatly. That's not communication magic, that's blood magic. The horn is feeding on the violence you've already committed, growing stronger with each death. Hakan's smile grew wider. Very perceptive. Yes, every person who dies at my command makes the horn more powerful and makes my warriors more effective. By now it's drunk so much blood that my men fight with the strength of berserkers and the coordination of a wolf pack. The revelation changed everything. No wonder Ironhold had fallen so quickly. Hakan's warriors weren't just numerous, they were magically enhanced. And with each death, the enhancement grew stronger. There's more, Hakan continued, clearly enjoying their growing horror. The horn's power works both ways. When I die, if I die, it will release all that stored violence at once. Every person within 10 miles will be consumed by berserker rage, unable to tell friend from foe until they're all dead. You're insane, Sigrid breathed. You'd kill everyone here, innocent and guilty alike, just for revenge. I'd kill everyone in the northern lands if it brought my son back, Hakan replied with perfect sincerity. But since that's impossible, I'll settle for making sure Bjorn Stonehelm suffers as much as possible before he dies. The implications were becoming clear. Even if they won the combat in the old circle, Hakan's death would trigger a magical catastrophe that would slaughter hundreds of innocent people. But if they lost, he would return to Ironhold with enhanced warriors and complete the massacre he had started. There has to be another way, Bjorn said, though even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. Hakan had planned this too carefully, had anticipated too many contingencies. The only way to save the people of Ironhold was to find a solution that didn't involve killing their tormentor. Actually, said a new voice from the darkness beyond the torchlight, there might be. The speaker stepped into the light, and several people gasped in recognition. It was a woman, tall and elegant, with silver-white hair and eyes the color of winter ice. She wore robes that seemed to shimmer between blue and grey and black, and power radiated from her like heat from a forge. Lady Valdis, Grandmother Helga whispered, and there was both reverence and fear in her voice. What brings a Vulva of the High Circle to these proceedings? Valdis ignored the question, her attention focused entirely on the cursed horn in Hakan's hand. That artifact was stolen from the sacred vaults of the Ice Temple. The man who gave it to you promised you power, didn't he? Promised you the ability to avenge your son. He promised me justice, Hakan replied. But for the first time, his confidence seemed shaken. The appearance of a high Vulva, a practitioner of the deepest and most dangerous magic, had clearly not been part of his plan. He promised you corruption, Valdis corrected. That horn was created during the Blood Wars, when the southern kingdoms tried to use dark magic against our people. It has drunk the life force of thousands of warriors over the centuries, and it hungers for more. Every time you use it, it takes a piece of your soul as payment. She gestured, and pale fire flickered around her fingertips. Look at yourself, Hakan Bloodaxe. Look with true sight and see what you have become. Hakan glanced down at his hands, and his face went white with horror. In the light of Valdis's magic, his skin showed the telltale marks of soul drain, dark veins running up his arms like poison, and a grey pallor that spoke of spiritual death. You're already dead, Valdis said with something approaching pity. The horn has been feeding on your life force since the moment you first used it. You have perhaps hours left before it consumes what remains of your soul. Then I'll make those hours count, Hakan snarled, raising the horn to his lips. If I'm dying anyway, I'll take as many of my enemies with me as possible. But before he could sound the call, Sigrid moved. Her hand flashed to the empty silver setting that hung at her throat, all that remained of her sister's pendant, and she spoke a single word in the old tongue. The setting blazed with pure white light, and the cursed horn cracked with a sound like breaking stone. The pendant wasn't just protection, she said, understanding flooding her voice. It was preparation. Astrid knew this day would come. She made sure I would have the power to stop it. The horn in Hakan's hand was dying, its runes flickering and fading as the white light consumed its corrupt magic. But as it died, Hakan himself began to change. The soul drain marks on his skin were spreading faster now, racing up his neck toward his heart. "You've killed me," he whispered. But there was no anger in his voice anymore, only a terrible, dawning comprehension of what he had done to himself. "No," Sigrid said gently. You were already dead. I just helped you realize it. As the cursed horn crumbled to dust in his hands, Hakan Bloodaxe fell to his knees, and for the first time since his son's death, he wept. The transformation in Hakan Bloodaxe was shocking to witness. As the cursed horn crumbled to ash in his hands, 20 years seemed to fall away from his face, leaving behind something raw and broken. The pale fire of soul drain still crawled along his skin, but his eyes, those cold, merciless eyes, suddenly held the look of a man waking from a nightmare. "My son," he whispered, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "What have I done?" "Eric would be ashamed of what I became." Lady Valdis knelt beside him, her expression compassionate despite the terrible things he had just threatened. "The horn's corruption runs deep, but it can be cleansed. There is still time to make different choices." "Time?" Hakan laughed bitterly. "You said yourself I'm dying. The soul drain has taken too much already." "Your body is dying," Valdis corrected. "But your spirit, that depends on what you choose to do with your remaining hours." The ancient vulva reached into her robes and produced something that made everyone present intake sharply. A crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to capture and hold starlight. The healing draught of the ice temple was legendary, said to be able to restore life even to those at death's threshold. "This can slow the soul drain, perhaps even stop it," she said. "But the price is everything you have left to give. Your remaining life force, your memories of hatred and vengeance, your power over the warriors you've corrupted with dark magic. Are you willing to pay that price to save the innocents at Ironhold?" Hakan stared at the vial, his hands trembling. Around them, the crowd waited in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than any tournament combat. This was a man's soul hanging in the balance, with hundreds of innocent lives depending on his choice. "If I drink that," he said slowly, "what happens to my men?" "The ones under the horn's influence. They return to themselves," Valdis replied. The berserker rage fades. The magical coordination breaks, and they become ordinary warriors again. Dangerous still, but not supernaturally so. "And they'll follow my orders? Even orders to withdraw?" "They'll follow the orders of the man they chose to serve before the corruption took hold. Whether that man still exists inside you." She left the sentence unfinished. Bjorn stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt, but his posture non-threatening. "There's something you should know, Hakan, about your son's death." "Bjorn," Sigrid said quietly, warning in her voice. "Now might not be—" "No," he interrupted. "He deserves the truth. Eric didn't die because he was a bandit or because he was my enemy. He died because he was protecting someone." The words hung in the air between them, and Hakan's eyes sharpened with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" "The merchant caravan we were hired to protect. It included a family fleeing from raiders, a man, his wife, and their infant daughter. When my warband engaged your son's fighters, the battle scattered everyone. In the confusion, some of your warriors broke off to pursue the fleeing civilians." Bjorn's voice grew heavy with memory. "Eric saw them going after the family. He could have escaped, should have escaped, but instead he turned back. He fought 3 of his own men to protect people he'd never met. When I found him, he was standing over the woman and her child, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but still fighting. He was protecting innocents." Hakon's voice was barely a whisper. "He died with honor," Bjorn said simply. "I killed him because I had to, but not before I saw what kind of man he was. He was everything a father could hope for in a son." The revelation broke something inside Hakan. He doubled over, racked with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He was better than me. Always was. I taught him to fight, but somehow he learned honor on his own. And I've spent 3 years dishonoring his memory." Lady Valdis held out the crystal vial. "Then honor it now." Choose what he would have chosen. With shaking hands, Hakan took the vial and looked at it for a long moment. The liquid inside seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, alive with power and possibility. When he looked up, his eyes had changed again, still marked by grief, but no longer consumed by hatred. "My warriors at Ironhold," he said. "How quickly will the horn's influence fade?" "The moment you drink," Valdis replied. But the transition will be difficult for them. They'll be confused, disoriented, possibly violent as the magical compulsion breaks. Then I need to be there. I need to be the one to call them off, to explain what happened. He looked directly at Bjorn. Your people are barricaded in the Great Hall. My men have been maintaining the siege, but they haven't attempted a final assault yet. The horn was making them wait for my signal. How long to reach Ironhold from here? Bjorn asked. 2 hours hard riding, Hakan replied. Less if we don't spare the horses. The silver setting at Sigrid's throat began to glow again, and she placed her hand over it with sudden understanding. Astrid, she whispered. She's still with us, still helping. The light from the setting spread outward, touching each person present with gentle warmth. But more than that, it carried with it a sense of urgency. Time was running out, and choices needed to be made quickly. The magic won't hold indefinitely, Valdis warned. Once Hakan drinks the draught, we have perhaps an hour before the horn's residual power reasserts itself. If we're going to save the people in Ironhold, we need to move now. Hakan raised the vial to his lips, then paused. Bjorn Stonehelm, he said formally, I have wronged you and yours. I have killed innocents and corrupted good warriors in service of my own pain. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can try to make amends. Then let's ride, Bjorn replied. Together. Hakan drank the draught in one swift motion, and the change was immediate and dramatic. The soul drain marks on his skin flared with blinding light, then faded to nothing. His face, which had been gaunt with corruption, filled out again, and his eyes cleared completely, but the cost was evident too. His hair had gone completely white, and deep lines marked his face like the passage of years compressed into moments. I remember everything now, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Every order I gave, every life I took, every choice I made, in service of hatred. The weight of it... He staggered, and Sigrid caught his arm. The weight is what proves you're human again, she said gently. Monsters don't feel guilt. Around them, horses were being saddled and weapons prepared. The tournament had become a rescue mission, and every warrior present knew that time was their enemy now. In the distance, the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky. The ride to Ironhold was a desperate race against time and magic. 30 warriors thundered across the dark landscape, their horses' hooves striking sparks from stone, as they followed paths barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Bjorn and Sigrid rode at the front, with Hakan between them. The former enemy now, their greatest hope for ending the siege without further bloodshed. The horn's influence is fading, Hakan called out over the thunder of hooves. I can feel my connection to the warriors weakening. When it breaks completely, they'll be confused, angry, possibly violent. Some may try to complete the assault out of simple momentum. How many good men do you have among them? Bjorn shouted back. Men who joined you for honor, not for blood. Most of them, Hakan replied, and there was pain in his voice. They followed me because they believed in justice for my son. I've led good warriors into dishonor. Lady Valdis, riding beside them on a horse that seemed to run on air rather than earth, raised her voice above the wind. The silver setting at Sigrid's throat, it's resonating with something at Ironhold. There's power there we can use, but only if we arrive before the magical backlash begins. As they crested the final hill before Ironhold, the scene that greeted them was both better and worse than they had feared. The hold itself still stood, its stone walls intact and defiant banners flying from the towers. But surrounding it was a sight that chilled the blood. Nearly 200 warriors arranged in perfect siege formation, their movements unnaturally coordinated, as they prepared for what looked like a final assault. They're moving, Olaf observed grimly. Whatever's been holding them back is weakening. Even as he spoke, groups of warriors began advancing on the walls with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders on the battlements loosed arrows, but there were too few of them to hold back such a coordinated attack. The Great Hall, Hakan said urgently. My men will go for the Great Hall first. That's where the civilians are barricaded. If they break through those doors, they won't, Bjorn said with grim determination. Not while we still breathe. They thundered down the hillside toward the siege lines, and as they approached, something extraordinary happened. The silver setting at Sigrid's throat blazed with light so pure and brilliant that it cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a sword. The light reached out, touching the confused and corrupted warriors below, and wherever it fell, men stopped in their tracks. Now, Hakan roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority of absolute command. "All warriors, hold your positions! Do not advance. That is an order from Hakan Bloodaxe." The effect was immediate but chaotic. Some warriors obeyed instantly, dropping their weapons and stepping back from the walls. Others seemed caught between conflicting impulses, advancing a few steps, then stopping, their faces showing the confusion of men waking from dreams they couldn't quite remember. But a core group, perhaps 30 men, seemed immune to both the light and Hakan's commands. These were the ones most deeply corrupted by the Horn's influence, and they continued their assault on the Great Hall with single-minded determination. "The inner circle," Hakan said, his face grey with understanding. "They drank directly from the Horn's power. The corruption runs too deep. They won't stop until they're dead or victorious." Bjorn and Sigrid exchanged a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. They had come this far together, faced impossible odds, and emerged stronger for it. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, side by side. "Olaf, take the men and secure the outer siege lines," Bjorn commanded. "Make sure the confused warriors don't get caught up in the fighting again. Hakan, can you rally the ones who are still themselves?" "Already working on it," Hakan replied, his voice carrying to the men below as he began calling out names and personal histories, reminding them who they really were beneath the magical compulsion. But the corrupted warriors had reached the Great Hall doors, and the sound of splintering wood echoed across the courtyard. From within came the screams of terrified civilians, women, children, elderly craftsmen who had never held weapons in anger. "The setting!" Lady Valdis called out urgently. "Use the setting now, while the veil is thin." Sigrid grasped the silver circle at her throat, and suddenly she could feel her sister's presence more strongly than at any time since Astrid's death. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as a guiding force, showing her what needed to be done. "Bjorn," she said, her voice filled with sudden certainty, "I need you to trust me completely. What I'm about to do, it might look like I'm abandoning you, but I'm not. I'll never abandon you." Before he could ask what she meant, Sigrid spurred her horse forward into the courtyard, the silver setting blazing like a star around her neck. The light that poured from it was no longer pure white. It had taken on colors, swirling patterns of gold and silver and deep blue that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere illumination. The corrupted warriors turned from the Great Hall doors to face this new threat, their eyes reflecting the unnatural red glow of magical compulsion. As they raised their weapons, Sigrid dismounted and walked toward them with steady steps, the light around her growing brighter with each pace. "I am Sigrid Ravensblade," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Daughter of Hakan, sister of Astrid, and bearer of the light that drives back darkness. You will not harm the innocent while I draw breath." The corrupted warriors charged, and the final battle began. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but something far more profound. A confrontation between light and darkness, between the power of love and the corruption of hatred. As the 30 corrupted warriors charged toward Sigrid, the silver setting around her neck blazed with such intensity that shadows fled from every corner of the courtyard. But instead of raising her sword, Sigrid did something that stopped even the corrupted warriors in their tracks. She began to sing, not a war chant or battle cry, but a gentle lullaby that Astrid had composed during the long winter evenings of their childhood. The melody rose and fell like mountain wind through pine trees, carrying with it memories of innocence and love that predated all the pain and loss. The effect on the corrupted warriors was immediate and heartbreaking. They stumbled, their weapons wavering, as the song reached something buried deep beneath the magical compulsion. One by one, they began to remember who they had been before hatred consumed them, Fathers, brothers, sons who had followed Hakan not for bloodlust, but for justice. She's not fighting them, Bjorn realized, watching in amazement. She's healing them. The silver setting pulsed with each note of the song, and with each pulse, another warrior dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. The red glow of corruption faded from their eyes, replaced by tears of recognition and shame. But the magic came at a cost. Sigrid was pouring her own life force into the healing, and Bjorn could see her growing weaker with each passing moment. The light around her was consuming her strength, burning away everything she had to give in service of saving others. "No," he whispered, then louder. "Sigrid, stop! You're killing yourself." She heard him, and for just a moment their eyes met across the courtyard. In that look, he saw everything she was trying to tell him, that some prices were worth paying, that love sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, that she would rather die saving innocence than live knowing she could have done more. But as her song reached its climax and the last of the corrupted warriors collapsed in cleansed exhaustion, something unexpected happened. The great hall doors swung open, and from within came a stream of light that matched and amplified the radiance of the silver setting. The survivors of Ironhold emerged. Men, women, children, elderly craftsmen, all bearing small tokens that glowed with the same pure radiance. They were fragments of the original obsidian pendant, pieces that had been thought destroyed, but had instead been distributed among the people, carried as protective charms without anyone understanding their true significance. "Astrid's final gift," Grandmother Helga said, her voice filled with wonder as she dismounted and surveyed the scene. "She didn't just make one pendant, she made dozens. Every person in Ironhold carries a piece of her protection." The fragments resonated with each other and with the silver setting, creating a web of interconnected light that surrounded the entire hold. Instead of draining Sigrid's life force, the magic began to flow back to her, strengthened and purified by passing through so many hearts filled with gratitude and hope. Hakan Bloodaxe stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by his warriors, no longer corrupted, but deeply ashamed of what they had done under the horn's influence. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hold. "I came here seeking justice for my son," he said, the words heavy with regret. "Instead I brought only death and dishonor. I cannot undo what was done, but I swear by the old gods and the new that I will spend whatever time remains to me trying to make amends." He turned to Bjorn, and when he spoke again, it was with the formal cadence of ancient tradition. "Bjorn Stonehelm, I offer you the blood debt of the Bloodaxe clan. My life, my warrior's service, my lands and treasure, all are forfeit to pay for the innocent blood that was spilled in my name." "I don't want your life," Bjorn replied quietly. "I want your help. The northern lands are full of people like us, warriors carrying old grudges, clans nursing ancient wounds, families torn apart by cycles of revenge. Help me break those cycles. Help me build something better." The offer hung in the morning air, heavy with possibility. Around them, the survivors of the siege, both besiegers and besieged, watched as their leaders chose reconciliation over retribution. "A new kind of warband," Hakan said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "One that fights not for conquest or revenge, but for protection and justice." "A family," Sigrid corrected, stepping forward to take both men's hands. "Because that's what we all are in the end. One family, divided by old hurts and brought together by new hope." As the sun crested the eastern mountains, its light fell on a scene that would be remembered in songs for generations to come. 3 former enemies stood together in the courtyard of Ironhold, their hands joined in an oath that would reshape the destiny of the northern lands. The silver setting at Sigrid's throat caught the morning light and reflected it back 100-fold, each ray touching another fragment of Astrid's protection and creating a web of connection that bound them all together. In that moment, surrounded by light and love and the promise of better days ahead, Bjorn and Sigrid began their life together, not with a wedding feast, but with the harder and more meaningful task of healing a broken world. The tournament at Ravensholm seemed like something from another life now, A simple contest that had grown into something far more significant. As they stood together watching the sun rise over their reclaimed home, both warriors understood that some victories were measured not in defeated enemies, but in the bonds forged between former foes. "So," Bjorn said quietly, slipping his arm around Sigrid's waist, "about that wedding," she laughed, the sound bright as silver bells in the morning air. "I think we've had quite enough drama for one lifetime. Perhaps we could try for something simple and peaceful? With you as my bride?" Bjorn grinned, the expression transforming his battle-scarred face. "I doubt anything will ever be simple again, but peaceful. Yes, I think we can manage peaceful." Around them, the people of Ironhold began the long work of rebuilding and healing. But for Bjorn and Sigrid, the work that mattered most was already complete. They had found each other, chosen each other, and proven that love could triumph over the darkest of legacies. In the end, that was victory enough for any warrior.